piece that's specific to math education are the sort of broad stereotypes and messages we get about who's good at mathematics and who's not. So we have notions of Asians being extremely good at mathematics, whites pretty good at mathematics, and Latinos and African Americans and even like Native Americans as being innately poor at mathematics. And because there are such ties sometimes of thinking about this as a biological issue, we start to treat these student groups differently, to the point where if an Asian gets a B in a or a white student gets a B in a mathematics class, we automatically kick them up because we think they have the ability. There are actually numerous cases in the literature where if an African American gets that same grade, sometimes we still don't recommend them to move on. So for me, this is related to sort of how we think about mathematics, that we think of it as much more of an innate subject matter versus literacy. We think everyone has the sort of ability to develop literacy, whereas we think somewhere around algebra, we think, well, that's when you really start to parse out those who are mathematically gifted and those who aren't. Because of that, because of some of the messages that have been passed out in the media, and that this has been produced from a long history of educational access, who has access educationally and who doesn't, it ends up being a little different racially in mathematics. This notion that mathematics is innate, and then this layering on of who's good at mathematics, ends up, we think that Asians are innately good at it, versus seeing the history of practices that allowed Asians access to education but didn't allow them access to labor unions, for instance. And so they have a much longer history of participating in education, whereas we have a long documented history of restricting access of African Americans to education, first through slavery, then through separate but equal, which was not equal, and then ever since sort of degrading the sort of schooling within urban centers, which has impacted them hugely. Not offering calculus, not offering AP courses in those communities, which gives them less access to universities. So a lot of times we're not really thinking through the access and the institutions that are giving certain populations access to education and not others, and how that's really being constructed. So that, to me, is much more of a racial component that's specific to math education. In kindergarten, that everyone has essentially the same intellectual ability. So when they start kindergarten, they have the same capabilities. They can think mathematically just as well as anyone else. It doesn't matter who you're talking about, whites, Asians, African Americans, or Latinos. But those, there's a couple pieces. One is those achievement differences that get cited all the time, and we don't really talk about where they come from, are really produced a lot through schooling. We haven't necessarily been able to parse out what part of that is schooling, but we know a big chunk of it's schooling, especially when you know kids enter kindergarten prepared to sort of learn math, and then they're not learning math, or they're learning basic math, not the sort of more complexity of problem solving in math. So the other piece that is related to schooling is sort of access to resources, which can mean tutoring. Tutoring has actually been a more common resource used in this country, and it's a very common resource used in different Asian countries, such as Korea and Japan. So those who have more money have access to the best tutors, and they produce stratification often through tutoring. So while they don't necessarily track students in math within their public schooling, their tracking actually happens through tutoring after school. And those who can afford tutors get to learn more mathematics. Those who have poorer tutors learn less, and some don't have tutors at all. So what we haven't really conceptualized is the diversity of experiences sometimes that Asians have in Asian countries. And even here, different Asian populations have different access. So this notion that all Asians are good at mathematics is a pretty simplistic notion when we consider the Hmong, when we consider Filipinos, who often don't have access and sometimes live in urban centers. Usually what we're thinking of are Japanese and Chinese and maybe Korean, which is a pretty narrow view of Asian. And we're not considering which wave of immigrants sometimes, or what generation of sort of American we're representing with this notion of who's good at math and who's not good at math. The other piece of it are the standardized tests, which we have quite a few problems with, yet they're producing these achievement differences. So some of it is schooling that's producing some achievement differences. Some of it is possible bias in the test that is privileging particular cultural knowledge and disadvantaging others because of cultural knowledge embedded in the test. Oftentimes it's not assessing how you're solving problems. Almost never does a standardized test ask you how you're solving the problem, ask you to explain it, which asks for a fuller repertoire of what we're asking for in mathematics. So they're assessing very limited sort of forms of what it means to sort of be mathematically enabled. And I think that privileges particular ways of learning math, who's learning math. So part of it's schooling, part of it's these sort of assessments that we're using that are usually pretty poor at actually assessing mathematics ability or performance more broadly.